The wrestling world stopped breathing at exactly 10:47 p.m. Eastern Time on November 30th, 2025. Survivor Series WarGames, the final premium live event of the year, was delivering everything fans could have hoped for and more. Inside the dual-ring steel structure, 10 of WWE's most dangerous competitors were tearing each other apart in the most brutal match concept the company has ever produced. The Vision's Braun Breaker was locked in combat with World Heavyweight Champion CM Punk in what had become a personal war spanning months of television. Blood streaked down faces. Bodies crashed through tables. The crowd in Chicago's Allstate Arena was on their feet, screaming themselves hoarse. And then everything changed. A figure dressed entirely in black tactical gear appeared at the top of the cage. No entrance music. No pyrotechnics. No warning whatsoever. The production trucks didn't cut to this person climbing the structure because nobody in the production meeting had been told this was happening. Commentary fell silent for 3 full seconds, an eternity in live television, before Michael Cole's voice cracked through the speakers with 4 words that would be replayed 10 million times in the next 24 hours alone. Who in the hell? The masked figure moved with terrifying purpose and precision. This wasn't some clumsy run-in by a debuting talent trying to get their bearings in the biggest moment of their career. This was calculated violence from someone who had done this before, someone who knew exactly where every camera was positioned, someone who understood that the entire wrestling industry would dissect every frame of what was about to happen. The way this person gripped the steel cage as they descended toward the ring told a story all by itself. These weren't the movements of a nervous rookie. This was a predator stalking prey. CM Punk, the self-proclaimed voice of the voiceless and current World Heavyweight Champion, had his back turned to the descending figure. The Second City Saint was focused entirely on Braun Breaker, the monstrous athlete who represented everything Paul Heyman's new faction, the Vision, stood for. Punk had spent the last 3 months cutting scathing promos about how Heyman had betrayed him, how the legendary advocate had chosen to build a new empire with younger, hungrier talent instead of continuing to manage the man who claims he's the best in the world. The personal hatred between Punk and Heyman had reached levels of vitriol that made their previous partnership seem like a distant memory from another lifetime. The crowd started to realize something was wrong before the wrestlers did. A low murmur rippled through the 17,000 fans in attendance, building into a wave of confused shouting and pointing. Some fans were pulling out their phones to record. Others were standing on their chairs trying to get a better view. A few smart fans near the hard camera started chanting "Holy SHIT" before anything had even happened yet, because they could sense the electricity in the air, that unmistakable feeling that accompanies genuinely unscripted moments in professional wrestling. The figure in black hit the ring canvas with a thud that echoed through the arena's sound system. CM Punk turned around, his face painted with blood and exhaustion, his eyes widening in recognition for just a split second before it happened. The masked attacker's boot connected with Punk's jaw in a superkick so devastating that the champion's body went completely limp before it even started falling. The sound of boot meeting bone was sickening, the kind of impact that makes even the most hardened wrestling fans wince. Punk's legs buckled, his arms went slack, and his eyes rolled back in his head as he crumpled toward the mat like a puppet with its strings cut. But the attacker wasn't finished. Not even close. As CM Punk's body fell backward, the figure in black was already moving into position with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this exact sequence thousands of times before. They grabbed Punk by the head, positioned him perfectly, and then leaped into the air to deliver a curb stomp so vicious that the entire front row gasped in unison. The champion's face was driven into the canvas with such force that his entire body bounced off the mat. Medical personnel at ringside instinctively started moving toward the ring before remembering they couldn't enter during a WarGames match. Paul Heyman, standing at ringside with his trademark smirk, looked genuinely shocked for perhaps the first time in his 40-year career in professional wrestling. Braun Breaker, who had been lying in the corner recovering from Punk's offense just seconds earlier, seized the moment with the instincts of a true opportunist. The second-generation superstar, son of Rick Steiner and nephew of Scott Steiner, dragged his broken body across the ring and collapsed on top of the unconscious CM Punk. The referee, having no choice but to count what was happening in front of him, slapped the mat 3 times. 1, 2, 3. The bell rang. Team Heyman had won Survivor Series WarGames. But nobody was celebrating the victory. Nobody was paying attention to the official result of the match. Every single person in the arena, from the wrestlers in the ring to the fans in the cheap seats to the production staff frantically adjusting cameras, had their attention laser-focused on the figure in black who had just changed the course of WWE history in the span of 15 seconds. Who was this person? The question exploded across social media like a nuclear bomb. Within minutes, Survivor Series was trending #1 worldwide on Twitter with over 300,000 tweets. Within an hour, the clip of the attack had been viewed 17 million times across various platforms. Within 3 hours, every major wrestling news site had published at least 5 different articles with 5 different theories about the masked attacker's identity. The speculation was intoxicating, maddening, and absolutely everywhere. The most obvious answer seemed almost too obvious, which is exactly why so many fans latched onto it immediately. Seth Rollins. The visionary. The architect. The man who had perfected both the superkick and the stomp as his signature moves over a decade-long career at the top of WWE. The man who had a complicated history with CM Punk that included legendary matches and bitter real-life tensions. The man who had been conspicuously absent from WWE television for the past 6 weeks with no clear explanation given for his disappearance. It made too much sense. The pieces fit together too perfectly. But here's where the story gets interesting, where the easy answer starts to feel like a red herring designed to make you look in the wrong direction while the real truth hides in plain sight. Yes, those were Seth Rollins' signature moves. Yes, Seth had every reason to attack CM Punk given their complex relationship. Yes, Seth had been missing from television at exactly the right time to make this kind of dramatic return possible. But what if that's exactly what someone wanted you to think? What if this entire attack was designed to frame Seth Rollins for someone else's agenda? The figure in black didn't celebrate after the attack. They didn't pose for the cameras or cut a promo or reveal their identity. They simply rolled out of the ring, hopped the barricade, and disappeared into the crowd before security could even react. The cameras tried to follow but lost sight of the person within seconds as they vanished into the mass of fans wearing black t-shirts and hoodies. By the time WWE officials reached the area where the attacker had entered the crowd, there was nothing to find except 100 confused fans with their phones out and no clear memory of which direction the person had gone. Paul Heyman's reaction told its own story. The wise man of WWE, the silver-tongued advocate who always has a plan and never shows genuine surprise, stood at ringside with his mouth actually hanging open for a good 10 seconds before he regained his composure. Was Heyman surprised because he hadn't orchestrated this attack? Or was he surprised because whoever he had hired to do his dirty work had actually pulled it off? The legendary manager quickly schooled his features back into his trademark smirk, but those 10 seconds of genuine shock had already been captured by a dozen cameras and would be analyzed frame by fans looking for clues about what really happened. Backstage, chaos erupted in ways that fans watching at home couldn't fully comprehend. Multiple wrestlers were pulled into emergency creative meetings that lasted until 3 in the morning. WWE's legal team was reportedly called in to review footage and contracts. Security protocols were immediately upgraded for every upcoming show. Triple H, WWE's chief content officer, was seen having intense conversations with various people throughout the night, his face a mask of controlled fury mixed with something that might have been grudging respect for the audacity of what had just happened. The immediate aftermath of the attack raised more questions than it answered. CM Punk was stretchered out of the arena to a chorus of concerned chants from the Chicago crowd who had adopted him as their hometown hero. Medical updates released through WWE's official social media accounts were frustratingly vague, mentioning precautionary evaluation and monitoring for concussion protocols without giving any real information about the champion's condition or when he might return. The World Heavyweight Championship picture, which had seemed relatively clear just hours earlier, was suddenly thrown into complete chaos with no title defenses scheduled and no clarity about whether Punk would even be medically cleared to compete in the near future. Team Heyman celebrated their WarGames victory with all the enthusiasm of people who knew they hadn't actually earned it. Bron Breakker, to his credit, looked conflicted in post-match interviews, acknowledging that the win would forever have an asterisk next to it but also noting that in professional wrestling, the only thing that matters is the result on the record books. Paul Heyman, when finally tracked down by backstage interviewers, delivered a promo for the ages that somehow managed to be both infuriating and captivating. He claimed complete ignorance about the masked attacker's identity while simultaneously making it clear that whoever it was had done the wrestling world a favor by taking CM Punk down a few pegs. But here's what kept fans up all night debating and theorizing and re-watching the footage over and over again from every possible angle. The body type didn't quite match Seth Rollins. The attacker appeared to be slightly taller, maybe 15 pounds heavier, with a different shoulder width and a different way of carrying themselves. The movements were similar to Seth's, almost eerily so, but there were subtle differences that true students of in-ring psychology picked up on immediately. The superkick came from a slightly different angle. The stomp had a different setup, a fraction of a second longer in the air. Were these differences significant? Or were they just the natural variations that happen when someone performs the same moves hundreds of times? Social media detectives went to work with an intensity that would make FBI profilers jealous. Frame-by-frame analysis of the attack video appeared on YouTube within hours. Forensic comparisons of body measurements and movement patterns flooded Reddit threads. Wrestling historians dug through decades of tape looking for anyone else who had used that exact combination of moves. The tattoos visible on the attacker's arms were analyzed and compared to the known tattoos of every wrestler who had ever worked for WWE or any of its competitor companies. Some fans became convinced it was Seth Rollins doing his best to disguise his body language. Others argued with equal conviction that it had to be someone else entirely, possibly someone who had never appeared in WWE before at all. The conspiracy theories grew more elaborate as the night wore on and exhaustion set in among the online wrestling community. Some fans suggested it was AJ Styles making a heel turn after months of playing the heroic veteran. Others proposed it might be Kenny Omega finally making his long-rumored jump to WWE under the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. A few people even suggested it could be Edge, despite the rated-R superstar having retired from in-ring competition earlier in the year. Every theory had its proponents and detractors, and the debates raged across every wrestling forum and social media platform with the kind of passion that only professional wrestling can inspire. But what if everyone was looking in completely the wrong direction? What if the answer wasn't hidden in complex theories about body measurements and tattoo analysis and contract negotiations? What if the truth was so obvious that nobody wanted to believe it because it seemed impossible? What if Dean Ambrose had come home? The lunatic fringe. The guy who had walked away from WWE in 2019 at the peak of his popularity, turning down massive money to bet on himself and his artistic vision. The man who had spent 5 years wrestling around the world under his real name Jon Moxley, rebuilding his reputation and proving he didn't need WWE's platform to be successful. The former WWE champion who had been one-third of the Shield alongside Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns, the faction that had dominated WWE for years. The wrestler who had mastered those exact moves long before Seth Rollins ever used them, who had in fact taught Seth many of the techniques that would later become the Visionary's signature offense. Dean Ambrose returning to WWE seemed impossible for 100 different reasons. His public statements about the company had been scathing. His interviews discussing creative frustrations and corporate restrictions had burned bridges that seemed permanently destroyed. His success outside WWE had been so complete that most fans assumed he would never want or need to come back. The conventional wisdom said that Jon Moxley was done with WWE forever, that he had found creative fulfillment elsewhere and would never return to the machine he had so publicly criticized. But conventional wisdom has been wrong before. And in professional wrestling, the word never has a funny way of meaning not right now instead of not ever. Wrestlers who swore they'd never return have walked back down WWE entrance ramps to thunderous ovations. Bitter rivals have become best friends. Seemingly impossible comebacks have happened so many times that the wrestling fans' vocabulary includes the phrase "anything can happen in WWE" as a core truism rather than empty marketing speak. The more you think about it, the more Dean Ambrose returning makes a twisted kind of sense that Seth Rollins returning doesn't. Seth is still under WWE contract, still appearing on television regularly when healthy, still very much part of the company's plans. Him being the masked attacker would be shocking but not surprising. It would be a swerve but not a revolution. Dean Ambrose returning after 5 years away, using the moves that made him famous before Seth adopted them, attacking CM Punk in the middle of the biggest match of the year? That would be seismic. That would be the kind of moment that defines an entire era of professional wrestling. Could Paul Heyman have orchestrated something this elaborate? The man is a genius at long-term storytelling and knows how to create moments that fans talk about for decades. If anyone could convince Dean Ambrose to return to WWE after everything that happened, after all the burned bridges and bitter words, it would be Paul Heyman. The Advocate has a reputation for getting impossible things done, for seeing angles nobody else can see, for playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else is playing checkers. As the night ended and the sun started to rise on December 1st, the wrestling world was no closer to having definitive answers about what happened at Survivor Series WarGames. WWE's official social media accounts remained maddeningly silent about the masked attacker's identity. No wrestlers had broken kayfabe to reveal the truth. No legitimate wrestling journalist had reported anything concrete beyond speculation and rumor. The mystery hung in the air like smoke, intoxicating and impossible to grasp. One thing was absolutely certain. Whoever that person was, they had just inserted themselves into the hottest angle in professional wrestling and guaranteed that every fan would be watching Monday Night Raw to see what happened next. To understand why Dean Ambrose attacking CM Punk at Paul Heyman's apparent behest would be the most shocking development in modern WWE history, you have to understand the brotherhood that was the Shield. You have to understand what these three men meant to each other, what they built together, and how their eventual separation carved scars that never fully healed. November 18, 2012. Survivor Series. The same event where, 12 years later, a mysterious attacker would throw the wrestling world into chaos. Three unknown wrestlers from WWE's developmental territory interfered in the main event, attacking Ryback and costing him the WWE Championship. They called themselves The Shield: Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns. They wore tactical gear. They entered through the crowd. They claimed to be fighting for justice in a corrupt system. They were unlike anything WWE had ever presented before, and they were immediately, undeniably special. The Shield wasn't just another faction thrown together by creative writers hoping something would stick. These three men had chemistry that cannot be manufactured or scripted. They moved as one unit in the ring, their offense flowing seamlessly from one person to another like water finding its natural course. Their promos crackled with the energy of true believers who genuinely wanted to change professional wrestling. Dean Ambrose was the lunatic, the unpredictable wild card who could switch from calm to violent in a heartbeat. Seth Rollins was the architect, the brilliant tactician who could outthink and out-wrestle anyone. Roman Reigns was the powerhouse, the muscle who backed up his brothers with devastating physical force. For 2 years, the Shield dominated WWE in ways that transformed the entire industry. They retired legends. They defeated established stars. They held championships and defended them with the kind of intensity that made every defense feel like a potential classic. But more importantly than any of that, they felt real. In an industry built on predetermined outcomes and scripted promos, the Shield felt like three actual friends who would legitimately fight the world for each other. The brotherhood wasn't an angle. It was genuine, visible in every interaction, every celebration, every time one of them was in trouble and the other two came running to help. And then Seth Rollins broke that brotherhood with a chair shot heard around the wrestling world. June 2, 2014. Monday Night Raw. The Shield had just finished a match, standing tall in the ring together like they had 100 times before. And then Seth Rollins picked up a steel chair. Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns, still celebrating their victory, didn't see it coming until it was too late. Seth drove the chair into Roman's back, then turned and smashed it across Dean's spine. Triple H and Stephanie McMahon walked out to greet their new protege as Seth Rollins stood over his former brother's broken bodies wearing a smirk that would haunt both men for years to come. The betrayal worked precisely because it felt so real. Seth's heel turn wasn't telegraphed or predictable. He didn't spend weeks acting suspicious or dropping hints that he was unhappy in the Shield. He just turned on his brothers in the middle of a celebration, choosing corporate success and personal advancement over loyalty and friendship. It was the kind of betrayal that cuts deep because it mirrors the real betrayals people experience in life. The person you trusted most, the brother you fought alongside, deciding that his own ambitions matter more than your bond. That's not just wrestling storyline. That's genuine human pain translated into entertainment. Dean Ambrose's reaction to the betrayal became the stuff of legend. The lunatic fringe didn't just accept Seth's turn and move on to the next program. He made Seth Rollins' life a living hell for months. He attacked Seth in parking lots, during matches, backstage, in the middle of the ring. He cut promos dripping with such genuine emotion that fans wondered how much of it was acting and how much was real frustration bleeding through. Dean's obsession with making Seth pay for his betrayal became his defining character trait, the wound that never healed, the betrayal he could never forgive. Their feud produced some of the most memorable matches and moments of that era. A lumberjack match that dissolved into chaos. A Hell in a Cell match where Dean brought a bag of thumbtacks and a clear intention to end Seth's career. A stretcher match that saw both men sacrifice their bodies for the sake of settling a score that felt more personal than professional. Every time they stepped into the ring together, the hatred felt real because in many ways it probably was. That's the magic and the curse of professional wrestling. The lines between reality and kayfabe blur until even the wrestlers themselves don't know where one ends and the other begins. Seth Rollins eventually won the WWE World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 31, his dreams of being the face of the company realized exactly as Triple H had promised when he recruited Seth to the Authority. Dean Ambrose chased that championship like Captain Ahab chased the white whale, coming close several times but never quite capturing it while Seth held the title. The story being told was clear. Seth's betrayal had worked. He had chosen personal success over loyalty, and that choice had made him the champion while Dean was left to chase dreams he could never quite reach. But then the wrestling gods intervened with the cruelest twist of all. Seth Rollins injured his knee in November 2015, requiring surgery and forcing him to vacate the WWE World Heavyweight Championship he had held for more than half a year, and who eventually won the vacant championship in Seth's absence. Dean Ambrose, capturing the title in June 2016 at Money in the Bank, achieving his dream at exactly the moment when Seth couldn't do anything to stop him. The Shield eventually reunited in 2017, the three members putting aside their differences to fight a common enemy. And then they reunited again in 2019 for what was meant to be a final run before Dean Ambrose's WWE contract expired and he chose not to renew it. Those reunions were magical, capturing the same brotherhood energy that had made the Shield special in the first place. But there was always an undercurrent of knowledge that it couldn't last, that the betrayal of 2014 had created fractures that could be smoothed over but never fully repaired. Which brings us to Paul Heyman and his complicated relationship with all three Shield members. Heyman had been Roman Reigns' advocate and special counsel during Roman's reign as undisputed WWE Universal Champion, helping to elevate Roman's character to new heights and contributing to what many consider the best work of Roman's career. That partnership had been gold, producing years of compelling television and establishing Roman as the true final boss of WWE. But that partnership had ended, with Heyman eventually aligning with CM Punk in what seemed like a return to their legendary pairing from the past. Paul Heyman and CM Punk had history stretching back more than a decade. Heyman had managed Punk during his epic 434-day reign as WWE Champion, the title run that defined Punk's career and established him as one of the greatest performers in company history. Their chemistry as advocate and champion had been undeniable, producing some of the most memorable promos in modern WWE history. When CM Punk returned to WWE in late 2023 after a bitter departure a decade earlier, everyone assumed Heyman would eventually end up in his corner again. But the vision changed everything. Paul Heyman's new faction, built around young hungry talents like Bron Breakker, represented a different philosophy entirely. Heyman wasn't interested in managing established stars anymore. He wanted to build a new empire with athletes who hadn't been corrupted by years of WWE's politics and creative restrictions. The vision was Heyman's statement that he could create stars from scratch, that his genius wasn't dependent on attaching himself to already successful performers. CM Punk took Heyman's new direction as a personal betrayal. The Second City Saint cut scathing promos about how Heyman had used him, how the advocate had always been more interested in building his own legacy than in his client's success. Punk claimed that Heyman was a parasite who attached himself to talented performers and then took credit for their accomplishments. The anger in Punk's voice during those promos felt real, fueled by genuine frustration about being passed over for younger talent. And here's where the Dean Ambrose possibility becomes truly fascinating from a storytelling perspective. Dean had never been Paul Heyman's guy during his first WWE run. Heyman had managed Brock Lesnar, CM Punk, and eventually Roman Reigns, but he had never been in Dean Ambrose's corner despite Dean being just as talented as any of them. There had even been a storyline in 2015 where Dean desperately wanted Heyman's counsel and Heyman refused him, viewing Dean as beneath his standards. The rejection had been humiliating for Dean's character and added another layer to his complicated relationship with WWE's upper management and authority figures. What if Paul Heyman attacking CM Punk through a proxy wasn't about Punk at all? What if this was about Heyman finally recognizing Dean Ambrose's talent and offering him the partnership that had been denied during Dean's first WWE run? What if the man who had previously rejected Dean was now offering him the chance to be the cornerstone of the Vision's destruction of CM Punk and everyone who stood in their way? That would be a story with layers upon layers of history and emotional resonance. The timing of Dean Ambrose's potential return couldn't be more perfect from a narrative standpoint. His contract with AEW had reportedly expired in recent months, though details about his contractual status had been deliberately kept vague by all parties involved. His public comments about WWE had softened slightly over the past year, no longer the bitter condemnations of his initial post-departure interviews but more measured reflections on a complicated relationship that didn't work out the first time around. Multiple wrestling journalists had noted that Jon Moxley seemed to be positioning himself for a potential return while maintaining plausible deniability. If Dean Ambrose had returned to attack CM Punk on Paul Heyman's behalf, it would represent one of the most complete character transformations in wrestling history. The lunatic who had always operated on instinct and emotion, who had rejected authority figures and fought against the system, would be aligning himself with the ultimate authority figure manipulator in Paul Heyman. The man who had made his reputation on loyalty to his Shield brothers would be working with the man who now managed a faction explicitly built to destroy everything the old guard represented. But here's the most delicious twist: what would Seth Rollins think about all of this? Seth had betrayed the Shield in 2014 to join the Authority and Triple H. He had chosen personal advancement over brotherhood, corporate success over loyalty. He had become everything the Shield had originally stood against when they debuted as rebels fighting against injustice and corruption. And while Seth had eventually turned back into a babyface and reunited with his former brothers, that original betrayal had defined his character for years. If Dean Ambrose returned and immediately aligned himself with Paul Heyman and the Vision, essentially doing exactly what Seth had done a decade earlier by betraying principles for personal gain, it would create a mirror image that would force Seth to confront his own past actions. How could Seth condemn Dean for doing the same thing Seth himself had done? And yet how could Seth watch his brother make the same mistakes he had made without trying to intervene? The psychological warfare potential of that dynamic is staggering. Roman Reigns adds another layer to this potential story. The tribal chief had his own complicated history with Paul Heyman, having relied on the Advocate during his record-breaking title reign before their partnership eventually dissolved. Roman's current status in WWE was somewhat ambiguous, with the original tribal chief taking breaks from regular television while maintaining his position as the company's ultimate final boss. Would Roman intervene if Dean aligned with Heyman? Would the tribal chief see this as a family matter that required his attention? The potential for a Shield three-way confrontation looms over all of this speculation like a storm cloud pregnant with electricity. All three members of the greatest faction in WWE history, each with their own complicated relationship to loyalty and betrayal, each having taken different paths since the Shield broke up a decade ago. Dean potentially returning as a hired gun for Paul Heyman. Seth as the established star trying to maintain his position. Roman as the tribal chief watching from his throne. The stories you could tell with those three men and their intertwined histories could fuel WWE programming for years. One wrestling historian noted something fascinating that sent conspiracy theorists into overdrive. The masked attacker at Survivor Series WarGames had used the superkick and stomp combination that everyone associated with Seth Rollins. But if you go back and watch old Shield matches from 2012 and 2013, you'll notice something interesting. Dean Ambrose used those exact moves regularly before Seth made them his signature offense. The super kick into stomp combination was actually part of Dean's independent wrestling arsenal before WWE smoothed out his moveset and made him more of a brawler. Seth had essentially adopted and perfected moves that Dean had used first. If Dean Ambrose was the masked attacker, he wasn't copying Seth Rollins. He was reclaiming his own offense, using moves that had always belonged to him, and in the process framing Seth for an attack that Dean himself had committed. That would be wrestling storytelling at its most elegant and diabolical. The betrayed brother returning to betray everyone else while making his former betrayer look responsible. The student surpassing the teacher by using the teacher's own signature moves against him. The lunatic proving he was always the architect all along. Of course, all of this remains pure speculation until WWE actually reveals who was under the mask at Survivor Series WarGames.